The ink on the contract was barely dry when the reality of my new life set in. Moving into Julian's limestone townhouse on the Upper East Side felt less like moving into a home and more like being checked into a five-star prison. My room was sprawling, filled with designer clothes I hadn't picked and a vanity stocked with perfumes that smelled like wealth and secrets. Julian was a ghost during the day, running an empire that spanned 3 continents, but at night, we were forced into a choreographed dance. Our first public appearance was at the Whitney Museum's annual gala. I spent 3 hours having my hair pulled into a sleek, severe bun and my face painted into a mask of aristocratic indifference. When Julian saw me at the top of the grand staircase, he paused. It was the first time I'd seen him look at me without calculating a ROI. For a fleeting second, his eyes softened, but then he checked his watch. "We're 4 minutes behind schedule," he said, offering his arm. As we moved through the crowd, he was the perfect husband. He held my hand, his fingers interlaced with mine so tightly it felt real. He laughed at my jokes, leaning in close so the socialites nearby could whisper about how smitten the Ice King seemed. But every time we were alone in a corner, his voice turned back to frost. "Don't drink the champagne, Alara. You need to keep your head clear for the press line. And remember, your mother called again. I've handled the debt collectors, so stop looking so worried. It ruins the aesthetic." The tension reached a breaking point when Marcus Sterling, Julian's bitterest business rival, approached us. Marcus had a smile like a shark and eyes that saw through everything. He looked at me, then at Julian, a smirk playing on his lips. "Quite a sudden match, Vane. I didn't even know you were dating anyone." Julian's grip on my waist tightened, a possessive reflex that surprised even him. "Some things are too precious to share with the public until the time is right, Marcus," Julian replied, his voice a low warning. Marcus turned his focus to me. "And what does a girl like you see in a man who views the world as a spreadsheet?" I felt Julian stiffen beside me, ready to deliver a cold, corporate rebuttal. But I stepped forward, looking Marcus dead in the eye. "I see the man who doesn't need to roar to show his power," I said, my voice steady. "And I see someone who values loyalty above all else." The silence that followed was heavy. Marcus eventually bowed his head and retreated, but the look Julian gave me wasn't one of gratitude. It was one of fear. For the first time I had stepped off the script, and for a man who controlled everything, a woman he couldn't predict was the most dangerous thing in the world. As we drove home in the back of the silent limousine, the space between us felt miles wide, yet when the car jolted, our shoulders brushed and the heat from his skin made me realize that the gilded cage was getting smaller every day. The aftermath of the Whitney Gala left a strange, vibrating silence between us. Julian didn't mention my defense of him against Marcus Sterling, but the next morning, a vintage 1950s leather-bound copy of my favorite poetry book was sitting on my breakfast tray. No note. Just the scent of old paper and the quiet acknowledgement that he had been listening when I mentioned it weeks ago. The performance, moved from the city to the Vane family estate in the Hamptons for a mandatory couples retreat, hosted by his formidable mother Eleanor. Eleanor Vane didn't just have high standards, she had a radar for insincerity. "If she suspects for 1 second that this is a business arrangement," Julian warned as we pulled up the long gravel driveway, "she will strip my board seat and tie up your family's settlements in litigation for a decade. Do you understand?" "I understand that you're terrified of your mother," I countered, smoothing out my linen dress. He didn't argue. The weekend was an endurance test of staged intimacy. We were assigned a single suite with 1 bed, a detail Julian had overlooked. That first night, the air was thick with the sound of the ocean crashing outside and the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock. I laid on the far left, he stayed on the far right. Between us sat the invisible ghost of the contract, $10 million of cold, hard barrier. "Alara," his voice broke the dark. It was softer than I'd ever heard it. "Yes. Why did you say those things to Marcus? About me not needing to roar?" I turned on my side, watching the moonlight silhouette his profile. "Because I've seen how you treat the staff when you think no one is looking. You're not the monster the papers say you are. You're just lonely." He didn't move for a long time. Then I felt the mattress shift. He turned toward me, his face inches from mine. In the shadows, the Ice King looked human. His hand reached out, grazing my cheek with a tenderness that wasn't in the script. "No one has ever looked past the spreadsheet before," he whispered. For a breathless minute, the contract didn't exist. There was no debt, no family medical bills, no publicists. There was just the heat of his skin and the way his breath hitched when I didn't pull away. He started to lean in, his gaze dropping to my lips, and my heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Then a floorboard creaked in the hallway, Eleanor making her nightly rounds. Julian froze. The spell shattered. He pulled back instantly, the wall of ice slamming back into place. "Go to sleep," he said, his voice once again a clinical monotone. "We have a charity polo match at 10. But as I closed my eyes, I knew something had shifted. The cracks were forming, and no amount of legal fine print could stop the thaw. I wasn't just playing a part anymore. I was playing with fire. The tension from the Hamptons followed us back to the city like a storm cloud that refused to break. Julian was colder than ever, overcompensating for the moment of weakness in the bedroom by burying himself in work. He didn't look at me during breakfast. He didn't text to check in. The contract was back in full force, a physical weight in the air between us. Then the floor fell out from under me. I was at a charity luncheon when my phone exploded with notifications. A tabloid had run a headline that made my blood run cold. "The Ice King's Queen, a past paved in scams?" Someone had dug up my father's old business filings, the ones Julian was supposed to have buried. They were framing my father's medical debt as a deliberate fraud and me as Julian's accomplice in a massive tax evasion scheme. I rushed back to the penthouse, my heart in my throat. I expected to find Julian with his lawyers, preparing my exit papers for breaching the no public scandals clause. Instead, I found him standing in the center of his office, 3 phones ringing at once, his face like granite. "Julian, I can explain," I started, my voice trembling. "The records, they're twisted. My father never meant." "I know," he interrupted, his voice surprisingly calm. He finally looked at me, and for the first time, there was no calculation in his eyes. "I've already traced the leak. It was Marcus Sterling. He's trying to tank our stock by painting you as a liability." "You have to let me go," I whispered. "The contract says if I bring disrepute to the vain name, the deal is void. You can save your company if you divorce me tonight." Julian walked toward me, his expensive shoes clicking on the marble. He didn't stop until he was inches away. "The contract also says I have the right to protect my assets," he said, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous rasp. "I'm an asset now?" I asked, a bitter laugh escaping me. "No," he said, reaching out to cup my face with both hands, a gesture so raw and unscripted it took my breath away. "You're the only thing in this building that isn't a line item. To hell with the contract, Alara. If I let you walk away to save a few points on the S&P 500, I'm the man Marcus thinks I am." He didn't call the lawyers to end the marriage. He called a press conference for that evening. We stood backstage, the roar of the reporters audible through the curtain. Julian took my hand, his grip firm. "This isn't business anymore," he whispered. "If we do this, there's no going back to the rules." "I don't want the rules," I admitted, my voice barely a thread. We stepped out into the blinding white lights. Julian didn't read from a script. He didn't mention the strategic partnership or the unfounded rumors. He looked directly into the cameras and said, "My wife is the most honorable person I have ever met. Anyone who attacks her character attacks mine. And I have never lost a fight." The room went silent. It wasn't the statement of a CEO. It was the declaration of a man in love. But as we walked off stage, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Check the safe in his study, Alara. Ask him about the redemption initiative. He didn't find you by accident." The ice was melting, but beneath it lay a secret that threatened to prove our entire love story was just another one of Julian Vane's hostile takeovers. The redemption initiative. The words felt like lead in my stomach as I stood in Julian's darkened study, the glow of his computer monitor casting long, skeletal shadows across the room. My fingers trembled as I keyed in the code I'd seen him use once, his mother's birthday. The heavy steel door of the wall safe clicked open with a sound like a heartbeat. Inside wasn't just jewelry or deeds. There was a thin blue folder labeled with my father's name. I opened it and my breath hitched. It wasn't just medical bills. It was a dossier on me, dated 6 months before we ever met. Photos of me at the hospital, transcripts of my bank statements, even a list of my favorite books. Julian hadn't found me by accident. He hadn't chosen a stranger to save. He had scouted me like a piece of distressed real estate. "I was going to tell you tonight," a voice said from the doorway. I jumped, the folder slipping from my hands, papers scattering across the Persian rug. Julian stood there, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He looked exhausted, stripped of the armor he usually wore. "You hunted me," I whispered, the sting of betrayal sharper than any ice. This wasn't a lucky break for my family. This was a targeted acquisition. By Julian. Out of all the women in Manhattan, why me? He walked into the room, not stopping until he was standing over the scattered papers. He didn't look at them, he looked at me. "Because your father worked for mine 30 years ago, Alara." My father. He wasn't the titan people remember. He was a thief. He embezzled the pension fund that your father was supposed to retire on. Your family didn't just fall on hard times. My family pushed them. The room spun. So the contract, the 10 million, it was just guilt? A way to pay back a debt without admitting your father was a criminal. At first, yes, Julian said, his voice cracking, a sound I didn't think he was capable of making. I thought I could balance the books. I thought I could buy my way into being a good man. But then you started talking back to me. You started seeing through the Ice King. And I realized I didn't want to balance the books anymore. I wanted to keep the girl. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It was the original contract. With a slow, deliberate motion he tore it down the middle, then again until the pieces fell like snow onto the dossier. "The contract is void," he said, stepping into my space, his warmth radiating through the chill of the room. "The debt is paid. The 10 million is yours, no strings attached. You can walk out that door right now and you never have to see me again. You're free, Alara." I looked at the door, then back at the man who had spent his whole life trying to control a narrative he inherited. For the first time, he wasn't a billionaire or a savior or a cold-blooded suit. He was just a man waiting for a verdict. "The contract said no feelings, Julian," I said, my voice finally finding its strength. "I'm in breach of contract," he whispered, his hand hovering inches from mine, waiting for permission. "I've been in breach since the night at the Whitney." I didn't walk toward the door. I closed the gap between us, grabbing his shirt and pulling him down into a kiss that tasted like rain, scotch, and a truth we both finally owned. We were no longer a transaction. We were a choice. Outside, the city lights of Manhattan continued to glitter, indifferent to the deals being made in the dark. But inside the penthouse, the silence was finally broken by something no lawyer could draft and no amount of money could buy. The Ice King had finally melted, and for the first time in my life I wasn't worried about the cost. The morning after the contract was shredded, the air in the penthouse felt dangerously thin. For the first time, there were no schedules pinned to the fridge, no scripted talking points for the press, and no protective layer of business to hide behind. We were two strangers who knew everything about each other's bank accounts but nothing about how we liked our coffee. The shift was jarring. Julian tried to be normal, which for a man who had spent 15 years as a corporate predator, was unintentionally hilarious. He tried to make breakfast, resulting in a smoke-filled kitchen and charred sourdough. "I've managed hedge funds with less volatility than this toaster," he muttered, waving a silk dish towel at the smoke detector. I laughed, a real belly-deep sound that made him freeze and just stare at me, his eyes wide and vulnerable. But the domestic peace was a bubble and Marcus Sterling was the needle. 2 days later, a legal summons arrived. Marcus wasn't just coming for Julian's stock. He was suing for fraudulent misrepresentation. He claimed our marriage was a sham designed to manipulate the market during a merger. If he could prove the contract existed, Julian wouldn't just lose his company. He'd face a federal indictment for securities fraud. "He found the shredded pieces," I whispered, looking at the legal papers on the mahogany desk. "The cleaners. Someone must have sold them to him." Julian didn't panic. He just looked at me, his jaw set. He has the physical paper but he doesn't have the intent. The only way he wins is if one of us testifies that the marriage was never real. The pressure was suffocating. My family's newfound security, the medical trust for my father, the very roof over our heads. It all rested on a lie that had become the truth. That evening, Eleanor Vane arrived unannounced. She didn't offer a hug, she offered a warning. Julian, the board is meeting tomorrow morning. They want a demonstration of stability. If you can't prove this woman is more than a paid distraction, they'll vote Marcus in as chairman. She turned to me, her eyes like chips of flint. He ruined his life to fix his father's mistake with your family, Alara. Don't let your feelings ruin what's left of this empire. If you love him, you'll leave before the deposition. If you aren't there to be questioned, Marcus has no case. I spent the night watching Julian sleep. He looked peaceful, his brow finally unknotted. Eleanor was right. If I stayed, I was the smoking gun. If I disappeared, the contract was just a rumor Marcus couldn't prove. I packed a single suitcase, the one I'd brought with me a year ago, filled with my old cheap clothes, and walked toward the elevator. The Ice King didn't wake up as the doors slid shut, leaving him alone in his glass tower. 3 months passed. I was back in my small apartment in Queens, working as a freelance researcher. My father was healthy, his treatments paid in full, but the silence in my life was deafening. I avoided the news. I didn't want to see Julian's face on a screen, cold and distant again. Then a black car pulled up to my curb. It wasn't Julian's sleek Maybach. It was a heavy, armored SUV. A man in a suit handed me an envelope. Inside was a single ticket to a rooftop garden in the city and a note written in sharp, decisive ink. The 365 days are up. I'm here to negotiate a new deal. When I arrived at the rooftop, the city was a sea of amber lights. Julian was standing by the railing, looking older, more tired, but his eyes lit up the moment he saw me. You won, I said, leaning against the brickwork. I saw the headlines. Marcus Sterling was ousted. The board gave you a vote of confidence. I didn't win, Julian said, walking toward me. I spent 3 months trying to find a way to make the numbers work without you. I ran every simulation, every projection. The result was always the same, a total loss. He reached into his pocket. My heart skipped. I expected a ring, but he pulled out a new document. It was 1 page long. What is this? Another contract? I asked, my voice trembling. Read the first clause, he commanded gently. I looked down. Section 1.1. The party of the first part, Julian, agrees to give up the title of CEO, the penthouse and 50% of his liquid assets to a charitable trust for families affected by corporate fraud. My eyes widened. Julian, you're giving it all away? Why? Because you were right, he said, taking my hands in his. I was lonely. I was trying to buy my way out of a legacy I hated. I don't want to be the Ice King anymore, Alara. I just want to be the man who makes you laugh at a burnt piece of toast. He dropped to one knee, but he didn't have a diamond. He had a simple gold band, his grandmother's. There is no end date on this one. No exit clause. No payout. Just me, a very complicated man with a lot to learn about being real. Will you sign on for a lifetime of unscripted moments? I didn't need a pen. I pulled him up and kissed him, the roar of the city fading into the background. I think I can work with those terms, I whispered. We walked away from the edge of the roof, leaving the world of billionaires and contracts behind. For the first time, we weren't a headline or a scandal. We were just 2 people who had found the one thing money could never buy. A love that survived the fine print. The contract was dead. Long live the truth.